Something is moving through the morning haze, and at first, your brain refuses to make sense of it. You're standing on a dry, open plain somewhere in ancient Asia, long before humans, long before horses as we know them, long before the familiar cast of modern grasslands has taken the stage. The air is dusty. The shrubs are low. The trees are scattered, with their leaves catching the first pale light of the day. And then, behind them, a shadow begins to rise. Not from the sky. Not from a cliff. From an animal. A living animal, walking slowly across the land on legs like pillars, its body swaying with the weight of several elephants, its head reaching so high that if you were standing beside it, you might have to tilt your head back like you were looking up at a second-story window. Which is already weird enough. But here's the part that makes it feel almost impossible. This is not a dinosaur. This is not some leftover giant from the age of sauropods. This is a mammal. A warm-blooded, hair-bearing member of the same grand evolutionary branch that eventually gave us horses, whales, bats, dogs, elephants, and unfortunately for everyone involved, us. And yet this creature seems like it wandered in from a different set of rules. Because mammals are not supposed to do this. Not usually. They can get heavy, sure. Elephants are heavy. Rhinos are heavy. Some extinct mammoths were absolute units, and I say that with respect. But height is different. Height is a strange gamble. It raises your head into a new world of food, but it also turns your whole body into a biological skyscraper that has to be fed, cooled, moved, protected, and kept alive every single day. And for a while, this gamble worked. Somewhere in the deep past, one branch of mammals pushed the body plan farther and farther upward until it produced a creature so tall that it still challenges our idea of what a land mammal can be. Today, we often call it Paraceratherium, though its scientific history has collected a few names along the way, because paleontology, like any good detective story, comes with revisions, arguments, and the occasional paperwork situation. But whatever name you use, the image is the same, a hornless relative of rhinoceroses, stretched into a form that looks less like the rhinos we know today and more like a giant living crane built out of muscle, bone, and appetite. Imagine a rhino if evolution grabbed it by the shoulders and pulled upward for millions of years. No horn tank charging through the brush. No low, armored silhouette. Instead, a long-legged browser moving across ancient landscapes, able to reach leaves that many other herbivores could only stare at from below, probably very resentfully. And that is where the mystery begins, because an animal like this does not just happen. A body this extreme is never just a fun evolutionary accessory. It is a clue. Its long limbs are clues. Its teeth are clues. Its neck, its skull, its enormous size, even the places where its fossils have been found, all of them are pieces of a case file scattered across time. They point to a world that once made this animal possible, maybe even made it powerful. A world where being towering, heavy, and hard to threaten could open doors that smaller mammals could not reach. Or, well, branches. Lots and lots of branches. But if Paraceratherium was such a successful experiment, then there's a problem. Because you may have noticed that there are no 20-foot-tall hornless rhino cousins strolling around Central Asia today, casually pruning the treetops and terrifying hikers. The tallest land mammal alive now is the giraffe, and even the giraffe is doing a very specialized, very giraffe-shaped version of tall. Paraceratherium belonged to a different world, and that world is gone. All we have left are the remains, bones pulled from ancient rock, teeth that survived when flesh did not, fragments that let scientists reconstruct not just a body, but a rise and a fall. And that fall is the part that makes this more than a story about size. Because the real question is not simply, how did a mammal become this tall? The real question is much stranger, and much more revealing. How can the same body that lets a creature dominate its world eventually become the thing that traps it? Because in evolution, being impressive is not the same as being safe. Being enormous is not the same as being permanent. And sometimes, the tallest animal on the landscape is not standing above danger. Sometimes, it is standing directly inside a world that is beginning, quietly, to change. The animal moves like the landscape belongs to it, not quickly, not nervously, but with the slow confidence of something that does not expect to be challenged. Each footstep presses into the dry ground with a dull, heavy finality, leaving a print that smaller animals might later step around without understanding what made it. Dust lifts around its legs. Insects scatter from the brush. A few lean trees tremble as its head passes through their upper branches, stripping leaves with the calm efficiency of a creature feeding from a level of the world that most mammals will never reach. From below, it would be hard to know where to look first. The legs, rising like columns from the earth? The long neck, not giraffe-like exactly, but still stretched enough to make the whole animal feel strangely vertical? Or the head, high above the scrub, moving from branch to branch as if it were browsing through shelves in a very leafy grocery store? And again, the most unsettling part is the mismatch. Your eyes want to sort it into something familiar. It has the weight and presence of a rhinoceros, but not the shape of one. It has the height of something closer to a giraffe, but not the delicate, narrow elegance we associate with giraffes. It feels almost like evolution took pieces from several different animals, rearranged them for a world that no longer exists, and then left us to find the receipts in the rocks. That is part of why Paraceratherium is so fascinating. It is not just big. Big is easy to imagine. This animal is big in a way that feels like a question. Modern rhinos are built close to the ground, with massive heads, thick bodies, and the general vibe of a living armored truck. Paraceratherium, though, belonged to the rhinoceros family tree without looking like the version of that family we know best. It had no horn. Its limbs were long. Its body was raised high. And its whole design points toward an animal that was not simply surviving by being massive, but by using height as a tool. Which sounds elegant, until you start thinking about what that tool would have demanded. Because every inch of that towering body had to be grown. Every pound had to be fed. Every step had to be supported by bones strong enough to keep the whole structure from turning into a very expensive evolutionary mistake. And fossils give us just enough to see the outline of this problem, while still keeping some of the most important answers out of reach. Paleontologists have found skulls, jaws, teeth, limb bones, and other fragments across parts of Asia, pieces that suggest an animal of astonishing scale. Some estimates place the shoulder height around 16 feet or more, with the head reaching even higher, and the body weighing many tons. That is the kind of number that sounds fake until you remember that the fossil record is full of nature quietly doing things that would get rejected from a monster movie for being unrealistic. But these bones are not just measurements. They are clues to a vanished way of life. The teeth suggest an herbivore built for browsing, not tearing flesh, not grazing like a cow in a field, but feeding on leaves, shoots, and branches. The long legs suggest an animal capable of moving across broad landscapes, perhaps traveling between patches of vegetation as climates and seasons shifted. The height suggests access, a private dining room in the treetops. And yet, nothing about this case is simple. Because the world beneath those feet was not a stable backdrop. It was alive with change. Forests expanded and retreated. Open habitats spread and shrank. Rainfall patterns shifted. The plants themselves were part of the story, and plants are never just scenery in deep time. They are the grocery store, the shelter, the map, and sometimes the trap. So when we look at Paraceratherium, we are not just looking at a giant animal. We are looking at an agreement between a body and a world. The body says, "Make me tall enough, and I can reach what others cannot." The world says, "For now, I will provide the branches, the space, and the conditions that make that worth it." But agreements in evolution are written in pencil. And somewhere in the long span of time, the conditions that made this towering mammal possible began to shift. The first strange clue is that its size seems like a triumph, but also like a dependency. If you are built to feed high, what happens when the shape of the vegetation changes? If you need huge ranges, what happens when useful habitat breaks apart? If your body is a masterpiece of height and mass, how easily can that masterpiece be revised? Paraceratherium was not a failure when it appeared. It was, for a time, one of the most spectacular answers mammals ever gave to the question of how to live large on land. But the next question is harder, and the fossils do not hand it to us neatly. Was this animal brought down by bad luck, by a changing climate, by disappearing food, or by the hidden cost of the very body that made it extraordinary? Long before the last of these giants vanished, the land had already given them almost everything a large mammal could ask for. Picture the scene not as a barren wasteland, but as a wide, broken world of open woodland, river valleys, and patches of trees scattered across ancient Asia. The ground is dry in places, softer near the water, and marked by the movement of animals that came there to drink, browse, and survive another day. Smaller mammals weave through the brush. Early predators keep their distance when they can. And above them all, Paraceratherium moves through the trees like a slow weather system made of bone and hunger. It is not rushing because it does not have to. That, by itself, tells us something. Animals do not become enormous by accident, and they do not stay enormous unless the world allows it. A body this large is not just a body. It is an ecological statement. It says there was enough food to build it, enough space to carry it, and enough evolutionary reward to make the cost worth paying. And for a while, that statement must have been true. The first real clues are not dramatic in the way a movie would want them to be. There is no final battlefield, no preserved herd frozen in panic, no single smoking crater with a sign helpfully labeled, "This is what did it." Instead, the evidence comes in pieces: a jaw here, a limb bone there, teeth worn down by meals eaten millions of years ago, skull fragments that turn an extinct animal from a rumor into a reconstruction. That is how deep time usually talks to us. Not in full sentences. In fragments. And the fragments from Paraceratherium tell a story of power before they ever hint at collapse. Its teeth, for example, are not the teeth of a hunter. They are tools for processing plants. They point toward a browser, an animal feeding on leaves and branches, perhaps pulling food from shrubs and trees in a way that smaller herbivores simply could not. And when you combine those teeth with its long limbs and towering posture, a picture starts to come together. This was not just a giant rhino cousin wandering around being impressive for the sake of it. It was built to live at a different height. It could browse over the heads of competitors. It could move across broad ranges. It could turn size into safety and height into access. In a landscape where food was spread out in patches, and where the most nutritious leaves might not be close to the ground, that could have been a spectacular advantage. Think about what that means from the perspective of a smaller animal standing nearby. For them, the world ends at shoulder height. For Paraceratherium, the world keeps going. A low tree is not a boundary. It is a buffet. A branch out of reach for almost everyone else is just breakfast. That is the kind of advantage that can reshape an animal over generations. Natural selection does not need a grand plan. It only needs small rewards repeated for a very long time. A slightly taller animal reaches a little more food. A slightly larger body becomes harder to threaten. Longer legs help it cover more ground between feeding places. And then, after enough time, the result is standing there in the morning dust, looking like a mammal that forgot mammals were supposed to have limits. But here is where the case gets interesting, because the same clues that show us its success also start to whisper about its vulnerability. A browser depends on plants. A giant browser depends on a lot of plants. A wide-ranging giant browser depends on plants arranged across a landscape in a way that makes movement worthwhile. So the body is not just telling us what Paraceratherium was. It is telling us what the world around it had to be like. There had to be enough vegetation at the right height. There had to be enough connected habitat. There had to be enough stability for an animal with such enormous needs to keep making a living. And that is a very specific bargain. It is easy to look at a giant and see independence, as if size frees an animal from the normal rules. But size can also tie an animal more tightly to them. A mouse can hide, switch foods, squeeze into new spaces, and reproduce quickly enough that change does not always hit the entire lineage at once. A towering mammal weighing many tons does not have that kind of flexibility. It carries its strategy in every bone. The fossil record does not yet give us a neat confession. It does not say, here is the moment the giant began to lose. But it gives us the setup, an animal that rose because the world rewarded height, reach, and mass. And once you see that, the mystery sharpens. If Paraceratherium was powerful because it matched its world so well, then what happens when the world it matched begins to disappear? The first clue is not the giant itself, but the menu it seems to have been built to reach. Imagine a paleontologist standing in a dry valley, holding a fossil tooth in one hand. It is not flashy in the way a claw or a skull can be flashy. It does not look like a weapon. It does not roar. It does not chase anything. It just sits there, hard, worn, and stubbornly quiet. But teeth are some of the best witnesses in the fossil record, because every meal leaves a trace. The shape of a tooth can tell you whether an animal sliced meat, crushed bone, ground grass, or stripped softer vegetation from branches. And the teeth of Paraceratherium point us toward a browser, an animal that fed on leaves, shoots, and woody plants rather than spending its life grazing close to the ground. That may sound like a small detail, but in a body this large, it changes the whole story. Because if you are a normal-sized herbivore, a patch of leaves is food. If you are an animal weighing many tons, a patch of leaves is a question. Is there enough here to keep you alive tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that? Now picture that enormous head moving through the branches, lips and teeth working through leaves while smaller animals feed below. The scene looks peaceful, almost majestic. But it hides something strange. Paraceratherium was not just eating plants. It was participating in a very specific agreement with its environment. The plants had to be there. They had to grow at reachable heights. They had to be spread across the land in a way that made travel possible. And the animal's body had to pay for every mile it walked between them. Which raises a question: was its height an answer to competition, or was it a response to a world where the best food was literally above everyone else? The next clue comes from the bones that held all of this up. Long-limbed bones are easy to admire because they make the animal feel grand, but they are also evidence of a problem solved over and over again. A creature that large cannot simply be a bigger version of a small one. Scaling up a body is not like dragging the corner of an image on a screen until it looks more dramatic. Bone has limits. Muscle has limits. Joints have limits. Feet have to meet the ground with enough strength to support the animal, but not so much force that every step becomes a slow-motion engineering crisis. So when scientists study the limbs of Paraceratherium, they are not just asking, how tall was it? They are asking, how did it work? How did a mammal carry that much body across uneven ground, through river valleys, between feeding sites, across a world that did not care whether its knees were having a difficult day? And that is where the image of the animal begins to change. It stops being just a giant silhouette on the horizon and becomes a moving machine with costs. Every long stride may have helped it travel farther. Every extra foot of height may have helped it reach more food. But every advantage also added to the bill. More bone. More muscle. More calories. More risk if the landscape stopped cooperating. However, the fossils do not only point to the animal's body. They also point outward, toward the vanished world around it. Paraceratherium fossils have been found across a broad stretch of Asia, suggesting that these animals, or their close relatives, once occupied large regions rather than some tiny, isolated corner of deep time. That matters, because a giant herbivore needs a giant stage. A creature this big cannot live like a rare collectible tucked into one little pocket of habitat forever. It needs room. It needs routes. It needs enough connected landscape to make its lifestyle possible. And for a while, the ancient world seems to have offered that. Open woodlands, river systems, patches of vegetation, places where a tall browser could move, feed, and keep going. But there is an uncomfortable clue hidden inside that success. The more widespread and specialized a giant becomes, the more it may depend on the conditions that let it spread in the first place. A small animal can sometimes survive when the world becomes patchy by hiding in the cracks. A giant does not fit in the cracks. It needs the map to stay generous. And then there is the strangest clue of all, the absence. Not the bones we find, but the giants we do not see anymore. The modern world still has rhinoceroses, still has elephants, still has giraffes, still has big herbivores doing impressive things with plant matter. But it does not have anything quite like this. No hornless rhino cousin towering over the scrub. No mammalian browser built on that same astonishing scale. That absence is not proof by itself, but it is a fingerprint on the case file. It tells us that whatever made Paraceratherium possible did not remain easy to repeat. So the first evidence gives us two stories at once. One is a story of power, teeth for browsing, limbs for height and movement, a body that could turn treetops into territory. The other is a story of vulnerability, a giant appetite, a dependence on the right plants in the right places, and a body plan that may have been brilliant only as long as the world kept honoring the bargain. But if the bargain broke, what changed first, the climate, the vegetation, the landscape, or the hidden math of being enormous? By now, the case has started to look almost too tidy. The teeth point to browsing. The limbs point to height and movement. The body points to a giant that made a living above the heads of other animals. So it is tempting to imagine the story as a simple one. Paraceratherium grew tall, ate leaves, ruled its world for a while, and then, when the trees changed or the climate shifted, the giant ran out of room. Nice, clean, emotionally satisfying. Also, probably too easy. Because in paleontology, the first suspect is rarely the only suspect, and this particular case has a whole lineup. One suspect is climate. Not in the dramatic, overnight disaster sense, with fire raining from the sky and every animal politely agreeing to go extinct on schedule. More like a slow rearrangement of the rules. Over millions of years, rainfall patterns can shift. Forests can thin. Open habitats can spread. River systems can move. The plant communities that once fed a giant browser can change their shape, their density, and their location. And for an animal that may have needed large amounts of leaves across a wide area, even a gradual shift could matter. Not because one dry season ends the species, but because generation after generation, the world becomes a little less convenient for a body that cannot cheaply become smaller, faster, or less hungry. But climate does not get to stand alone in the interrogation room. Another suspect is vegetation itself. Plants may seem passive, which is frankly very good branding on their part, but in deep time they are some of the most powerful forces on Earth. They build habitats. They feed herbivores. They change soils. They decide, indirectly, which bodies make sense. If the available food moved lower, became tougher, became more seasonal, or became spread out in a less reliable way, then Paraceratherium's height might have gone from a superpower to a very awkward specialization. A browser built to reach up cannot automatically become a grazer built to crop food from the ground. Teeth, jaws, necks, lips, guts, and habits all come with history. Evolution can revise a body, but it does not hit undo and start from a blank page. And then there is geography, the quiet suspect that often gets away with everything. A giant animal needs a landscape it can move through. If suitable habitats become fragmented, if deserts expand, if mountain building or changing river systems alter migration routes, then the problem is not just food. It is access to food. Imagine a creature that can see a line of trees on the horizon but must spend days crossing dry ground to reach them. Now imagine that distance growing longer over thousands of years. No single step looks like extinction. But the map is becoming less friendly, and the animal is too large to ignore the cost. However, the mini twist is that Paraceratherium's disappearance may not have been caused by one villain at all. The more we look at the clues, the more the case starts to look like a conspiracy of ordinary forces. Climate changes the plants. Plants change the food supply. Geography changes access. Body size changes how expensive every problem becomes. And suddenly, the question is not, which one killed the giant? It is, how many small pressures can a giant body absorb before its greatest strength stop being enough? This is where the story becomes more complicated than a simple rise and fall curve. Because Paraceratherium was not necessarily a fragile mistake waiting to collapse. It appears to have been a successful animal across a significant stretch of time and space. That matters. It means we should not treat its size like a doomed gimmick. For a while, being huge worked. It may have helped adults avoid most predators. It may have helped them travel between feeding areas. It may have let them browse above competitors in habitats where height paid off. The body was not the problem by itself. The body was the solution. The problem came when the question changed. And that is a very different kind of extinction story. A bad design failing is simple. A good design becoming outdated is much more unsettling. Scientists face this problem all the time when reconstructing ancient life. The fossils can show what an animal was well suited for, but they cannot always tell us exactly when the world stopped rewarding that suit. A tooth can preserve the memory of meals. A limb bone can preserve the logic of movement. A skull can hint at how the animal held its head, how it fed, how it occupied space. But the moment when a winning strategy becomes a liability is harder to fossilize. There is no bone labeled the beginning of the end. Instead, there are patterns, where fossils appear, where they stop appearing, what kinds of environments surrounded them, what other animals rise as they fade, and what the rocks say about the climate shifting under everyone's feet. Which brings us back to that towering animal in the ancient morning haze. It looked almost untouchable. And maybe, to the predators around it, it was. But extinction does not always come with teeth. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the landscape is not the hunter watching from the brush, but the slow disappearance of the world your body was built to understand. So if the usual suspects are climate, plants, geography, and the cost of size, the next question is even sharper. Which clue tells us when power began turning into a trap? The clues now start to pull on each other, like threads in the same net. Start with the body. Paraceratherium was enormous, and that size gave it reach, presence, and probably a kind of safety that most mammals could only dream of. But why would a mammal need to become that tall in the first place? The answer seems to lead us back to food. Its teeth point toward browsing, toward a life spent taking leaves, shoots, and branches rather than cropping low plants from the ground. So the body makes sense as a feeding machine, long limbs to raise it higher, a high head to reach vegetation, a massive frame to process and support the whole operation. But then the food raises a new question. What kind of world produces enough reachable vegetation to make a many-ton browser a good idea? That question pushes us from anatomy into ecology. We have to stop looking at the animal as a standalone marvel and start looking at it as part of an ancient system. Open woodlands, river corridors, patches of forest, seasonal growth, and plant communities spread across broad landscapes would not just be background scenery. They would be the infrastructure that kept the giant alive. A single tree was not enough. A single valley was not enough. This animal needed a world that could keep offering the right kind of food again and again as it moved through space and time. Which raises the next question: if the ecosystem was so important, what could have changed in that ecosystem? Now the trail leads into climate and geology. Over deep time, Asia was not sitting still like a stage set. Continents moved. Mountain ranges rose. Weather patterns shifted. Interiors of continents could become drier. Forests could retreat or reorganize. The balance between wooded habitats and more open, arid spaces could change. And those changes would not have affected every animal equally. A small herbivore might switch foods, breed quickly, or survive in pockets of habitat. A giant browser would feel the change through its entire body. Less reliable vegetation means more distance between meals. More distance means more energy spent walking. More energy spent walking means the animal needs even more food to make the trip worthwhile. And suddenly, the same long legs that once helped connect feeding grounds are being asked to solve a problem that is growing faster than they can. But that answer opens another question: why not just adapt? Why did the lineage not simply become smaller, shift its diet, or evolve into something more flexible? And here the story loops back to the body, but now the body looks different. Earlier, those long limbs and that towering frame seemed like signs of power. Now they look like commitments. Evolution works with what is already there. A population can change over generations, yes, But it does not get to calmly redesign itself because the forecast looks bad. If an animal is specialized for hide browsing, then changing its lifestyle could require changes in teeth, jaws, neck posture, digestive strategy, movement, reproductive timing, and behavior. That is not impossible, but it is not easy either, especially when the environment may be shifting across huge regions and over long spans of time. So the body answers the food question leads to the ecosystem leads to climate and landscape change, and climate change sends us right back to the body with a new realization. The giant was not just living in its environment. It was calibrated to it. That is the scary part. A well-calibrated animal can look unstoppable while the system around it remains stable. But when the system drifts, calibration can become dependence. Think of it like owning a very impressive vehicle that only runs on a fuel sold in a few towns, on roads that are slowly disappearing. For a while, it is amazing. Then it is inconvenient. Then it is impossible. And Paraceratherium may have faced a biological version of that problem. Not in one dramatic afternoon, but in the slow math of generations. A little less suitable habitat here. A little more distance there. A few plant communities changing. A few reproductive seasons becoming harder. No single clue solves the case, but the clues begin to form a pattern. Height helps if food is high and available. Size helps if resources are abundant enough to support it. Long-distance movement helps if the places you need to reach are still connected. But if those conditions weaken together, the whole strategy begins to wobble. And then there is still one missing piece. We can see the possible pressures. We can see why a giant body would make those pressures worse. But to understand the fall, we need to know what was happening around Paraceratherium as its world changed. Were new competitors moving into the same spaces? Were plant communities shifting faster than this lineage could follow? Were younger, more flexible mammals beginning to thrive in habitats where a towering browser struggled? The mystery is no longer whether size had a cost. It clearly did. The sharper question is whether that cost became unbearable because the world stopped paying it back. The strange thing about a giant is that it can make danger look smaller than it really is. When you imagine Paraceratherium moving across an ancient floodplain, it is easy to focus on what could not touch it. Most predators would have had a serious size problem. A full-grown adult was not an easy target. It did not need armor like an ankylosaur, or tusks like a mammoth, or the explosive speed of a deer. Its defense may have been simpler and more intimidating, be so large that most trouble decides to bother someone else. And for a long time, that probably worked. But this is where the story turns, because the forces that matter most in evolution are not always the ones with claws. We tend to picture extinction as a fight. One animal loses. Another animal wins. A stronger competitor arrives. A better predator evolves. The old giant is pushed aside by the new champion. And sometimes that is part of the story. But with Paraceratherium, the deeper twist is that its biggest problem may not have been an enemy at all. It may have been the disappearance of the conditions that made its body make sense. That sounds less dramatic than a battle, but it is far more unsettling. Because you cannot outrun a shifting climate. You cannot intimidate a changing plant community. You cannot stare down a landscape that is slowly drying out, breaking apart, or rearranging the routes between meals. And you definitely cannot bite the concept of habitat fragmentation, which is rude, because that would be very satisfying. So the giant begins to look different. Earlier, its height seemed like a crown. Now it starts to look like a contract, and the fine print is brutal. The contract says, you may grow tall enough to feed where others cannot, but only as long as the right vegetation exists. You may become massive enough to discourage predators, but only as long as enough food pays for that mass. You may stride across large territories, but only as long as those territories remain connected. Break any one of those terms, and the animal survives with difficulty. Break several at once, and the whole strategy starts to fail. That is the big reversal. Paraceratherium was not defeated because it was poorly adapted. It may have been defeated because it was adapted too well to a world that changed underneath it. In a stable world, specialization can look like genius. In a changing world, specialization can become a trap. And the taller, heavier, and more resource-hungry the animal is, the faster that trap can tighten. Think about a smaller herbivore living in the same broad region. If the forest thins, it may shift toward shrubs. If one patch dries out, it may move into a smaller refuge. If food becomes seasonal, it may reproduce quickly enough that some descendants make it through the bad years. But Paraceratherium carried its lifestyle in a body that could not easily bargain with scarcity. It needed a lot, and it needed it regularly. A giant browser is not just looking for food. It is looking for enough food to justify being a giant browser. And that is a much harder job. This is also where competition re-enters the case, but not as the obvious villain. Maybe other herbivores were not directly pushing Paraceratherium into oblivion like rivals in a nature documentary showdown. Instead, they may have been part of a changing ecological crowd. As environments became more open or patchier, different kinds of mammals could do well. Animals that were smaller, more flexible, better suited to different plants, or better able to live in habitats where a towering browser had less of an edge. The giant did not have to be beaten in a head-to-head contest. It only had to become less efficient than the alternatives. And evolution is very good at noticing inefficiency. Slowly. Quietly. Without music. The haunting part is that there may have been no single moment when the advantage vanished. One generation still finds enough leaves. The next travels a little farther. Another survives, but fewer young make it through. A once generous landscape becomes a series of increasingly expensive errands. The animal still looks powerful. It may still tower over everything around it. But the world is no longer paying back the cost of that height. And once you see it that way, the fall of Paraceratherium stops looking like the defeat of a monster and starts looking like something more precise. The collapse of a deal between anatomy and environment. The body had been a brilliant answer to an ancient question. But the question changed. And when that happens, even a spectacular answer can become wrong. So the mystery is not just why the giant disappeared. It is why the same traits that once made it extraordinary could not be turned, quickly enough, into something else. Was the lineage simply trapped by size? Were the plants changing in ways its teeth and body could not follow? Or was the real killer not one pressure, but the moment when several ordinary pressures began working together, each one small enough to seem survivable, until the tallest mammal in the landscape was standing on a foundation that was no longer there? By this point, the case no longer has the shape of a simple disappearance. It looks more like several quiet alarms going off at once, each one in a different part of the ancient world. One alarm is in the teeth. They still point to an animal built around browsing, around reaching and processing leaves from shrubs and trees rather than living like a low grazer on open ground. Another alarm is in the limbs, those long supports that made the animal impressive, mobile, and expensive. Another is in the map itself, in the places where fossils appear across Asia and then, eventually, stop appearing. And another is written not in bone, but in the changing character of the land, forests shifting, open spaces spreading, climate patterns becoming less friendly to the kind of giant that needed a generous world beneath its feet. None of these clues, alone, walks into the room and confesses. That would be convenient, and fossils are rarely that polite. But together, they begin pointing in the same direction. Paraceratherium was not living outside the rules of its ecosystem. It was one of the most extreme expressions of those rules. Its body made sense when tall browsing paid off, when enough vegetation existed in enough places, when the distance between meals was worth traveling, and when being enormous bought more advantages than it cost. But if the world grew drier in some regions, if wooded habitats thinned or moved, if plant communities changed, if useful feeding grounds became more scattered, then each part of that bargain started to crack. The animal did not have to be suddenly helpless. It only had to become slightly less able to make the math work. And in evolution, bad math repeated for long enough becomes destiny. Imagine following one of these giants near the end of its lineage, not at the instant of doom, Because there may not have been one, but during the slow tightening of the trap, it still towers over the scrub. It still reaches food smaller animals cannot. It still looks, from the outside, like a creature that has won. But the landscape around it is less forgiving than it used to be. A patch of trees that once fed a herd for days now runs out faster. The next patch is farther away. A dry season lasts longer than expected. Young animals, smaller and more vulnerable, pay first. Adults survive the hard years, until there are too many hard years stacked too close together. Nothing in that scene looks like a mass extinction. No single catastrophe announces itself. But the world is changing the terms of survival one ordinary detail at a time. And then, another clue comes into focus: the rise of other ways to be a successful mammal. While Paraceratherium represented one spectacular experiment, mammals were not placing all their bets on height. Across the Cenozoic, different herbivores explored different solutions: faster bodies, tougher teeth, more flexible diets, different digestive strategies, new ways of living in more open habitats. The giant browser was not necessarily pushed off the stage by one obvious rival, but the stage itself was filling with alternatives. And alternatives matter. If the environment begins to reward animals that can handle lower vegetation, tougher plants, more seasonal resources, or smaller ranges, then a towering specialist becomes less like a king and more like an old technology in a new market. Still impressive. Still beautiful in its own way. Just increasingly mismatched to the job. This is where the investigation comes close to its answer. The fossils show a body built for a particular way of life. The ecology suggests that way of life depended on the right kind of vegetation spread across the right kind of landscape. The changing climate and geography suggest that those landscapes were not permanent. And the broader story of mammals suggests that when the rules changed, other body plans may have been better positioned to keep playing. So the fall of Paraceratherium was probably not a single blow. It was a convergence. Climate did not have to act alone. Plants did not have to act alone. Competition did not have to act alone. Body size did not have to doom it from the beginning. The truth is more interesting, and maybe less comforting. A trait can be an advantage until several parts of the world shift at once, and then that same trait becomes a liability. Height was useful until food became harder to find at the right scale. Mass was protective until it became too costly. Long-distance movement helped until the distances grew too large, or the rewards too uncertain. The giant did not fall because Earth suddenly hated giants. Earth does not work that way. It simply kept changing. And life, as always, had to keep up or be left behind. That is the deeper pattern hiding inside this animal's bones. Paraceratherium was not just a strange extinct mammal with an extraordinary silhouette. It was a test of how far mammalian bodies could go when the world made room for them. And for millions of years, the answer was very far. Far enough to make a rhino relative rise above the trees. Far enough to turn height into a feeding strategy and size into a shield. But not far enough to escape the one force every species eventually faces: a planet that does not preserve the conditions that made you successful. So as the clues come together, the mystery sharpens into something bigger than one vanished giant. If even a body this powerful could become outdated when Earth changed around it, then what does success really mean in the history of life? Is it dominance? Is it size? Is it reaching higher than anything else? Or is it something quieter, stranger, and much harder to see in a fossil: the ability to remain useful when the world stops being the world your ancestors were built for? In the end, the giant's story does not point to one neat culprit standing over the scene with a smoking fossil. It points to something bigger, slower, and harder to see while it is happening. Paraceratherium rose because, for a time, its body matched its world beautifully. Height gave it access. Size gave it safety. Long legs gave it range. Its anatomy was not a mistake. It was a solution, written in bone, to a landscape where reaching higher and moving farther could pay off. But solutions in evolution are never permanent. They are answers to temporary questions. And when the question changes, even a brilliant answer can become dangerously out of date. That is the real turn in this case. The same body that once made Paraceratherium extraordinary also made it expensive. The same height that opened the upper branches also tied it to the availability of those branches. The same mass that made adults difficult to threaten also demanded a steady supply of food across broad spaces. The same long-distance movement that helped it travel through an ancient world only worked if the next useful patch of habitat was still reachable. So the fall of this animal was not just the fall of a giant. It was the breaking of a bargain between anatomy and environment. For millions of years, the bargain held. Then forests shifted. Climates changed. Habitats rearranged. Other mammals found different ways to survive in a changing world. And the tallest browser in the landscape, the animal that once seemed to stand above the rules, turned out to be bound to them as tightly as anything else. That is what makes its disappearance so haunting. It was not too small to compete. It was not too weak to matter. It may have been too specialized, too costly, too perfectly shaped for a version of Earth that was already fading. And that should make us rethink what we mean when we call any species successful. Because success in deep time is not a trophy. It is a moving target. A body can dominate one chapter and struggle in the next. A feature can begin as an advantage and end as a burden. Teeth, limbs, lungs, fur, hooves, brains, wings, all of them are compromises with the world as it exists at a given moment. And the moment never lasts. We can see that in the animals around us now. Giraffes still reach into the trees, elephants still carry enormous bodies across shrinking landscapes, rhinoceroses still move through the world like echoes of a much older mammalian experiment. Even our own bodies are full of ancient bargains, backs shaped by walking upright, teeth shaped by diets that change faster than jaws, brains powerful enough to imagine the future and anxious enough to worry about it at 3 a.m. Very helpful, thank you, evolution. But every living thing, including us, is built from the same kind of temporary agreement. The environment offers a set of conditions. Life answers with a body. Then the environment changes the terms. Fossils are how we find the old contracts after they have expired. A tooth becomes a receipt for vanished meals. A limb bone becomes evidence of a vanished way of moving. A skull becomes a frozen argument about what once worked. And when scientists piece those clues together, they are not just rebuilding an animal. They are reconstructing a lost version of Earth, one where a hornless rhino relative could rise above the trees and make that impossible-looking body seem reasonable. But the final clue is not hidden in a bone. It is hidden in the absence. No animal like Paraceratherium walks the planet now. The sky is still there. The trees are still there. Mammals are still here. But that particular answer to life on land is gone. And maybe that is the most important part of the mystery. Earth did not need to destroy the giant in a single catastrophic moment. It only needed to stop being the world that made the giant make sense. So if the question is how a body that once ruled its world could become the reason it disappeared, the answer is this: evolution does not build for forever. It builds for now. And deep time is what happens when now keeps ending. Somewhere in the rocks of ancient Asia, the bones of Paraceratherium still hold the outline of an animal that reached higher than any land mammal before or since. But the more astonishing image is not just that towering creature alive in the morning haze. It is the empty space it left behind, a place in the world tall enough for a giant, after the world had already moved on.